Let's take a few more minutes to talk about yield to maturity, where this yield to maturity comes from, how the market derives a particular required return or a particular yield to maturity. And so, first of all, let's remember the yield to maturity is the discount rate that is received by bondholders when they hold the bond all the way until maturity, in other words, until the principal amount is paid off. And it's the rate that the market decides. The market determines this rate. And it's the discount rate. Now, there are three factors that influence what this yield to maturity is going to be. In other words, is the yield to maturity 8% or is it 12%? There are three basic factors. The first one is referred to as the required real rate of return. And we're referring here to a risk-free rate, the real risk-free rate. Now, why do we call it real? Well, we're referring to this as real because it's not what we see. What we see is different from what's real. What we see in the market, if we look at a bond with a yield to maturity of 12%, what we see is an interest rate that accounts for the probability that there will be inflation in the future. So the real return is the return without inflation built in. The observed return has inflation, an inflation premium built in. We'll talk about this in a little more detail shortly. And then finally, some businesses are riskier than others, and the riskier businesses have to pay a higher interest rate. So this is in addition to the risk-free component, which is the same for everybody. To the extent that one business is riskier than another, it's going to pay a higher rate. So the real rate of return, the risk-free rate, real risk-free rate, is demanded for the use of the funds on a non-adjusted basis, meaning not adjusted for inflation, not adjusted for risk. The inflation premium compensates the holder of the bond for the fact that inflation is going to make future dollars worth less and less to him. So he knows inflation is coming. There's some estimate of what that inflation will be in the market, and the yield to maturity has to reflect that inflation component. And finally, we have the risk component that compensates the holder of the bond for the chance that the company just won't make the payments that it promised. So that's the compensation for the riskiness of the investment. The first two, the risk-free real rate and the inflation rate, don't have any risk component to them. They just reflect the overall inflation and what's required, even the required return, even for bonds that had no risk at all. So where might this risk come from? Well, one element is business risk, which is the inability of the firm to remain competitive and stable and to continue to grow the firm. So that it's possible that the underlying business might have problems. In addition, even if the business itself isn't having problems, if it's been overly aggressive in issuing debt, it's possible that it will be unable to meet its obligations just because it made too many promises. And so that's the financial risk, the inability of the firm to meet its debt obligations as they come due. Now, let's sort of put these pieces together and look at the required return or a yield to maturity, what that might be. And this would apply not only to bonds where we have a yield to maturity, but to any investment. We have an assumption here of a risk-free rate of 3%, and if the inflation rate that's expected is 4%, then we would add the real rate of return to the inflation premium right here in this first step. That would give us a risk-free rate that is adjusted for inflation of 7%. If the risk premium for a particular investment is 3%, then the overall required rate of return or yield to maturity on a bond, if we're talking about a bond, would be 10%. We typically think of U.S. government debt as being risk-free. It's certainly the least risky debt probably in the world. There are very few countries that have the same low level of risk as a U.S. government bond. So if anything is risk-free, that's it. So you would expect the U.S. government to pay 7% for borrowing, say, on a 10-year basis, and a corporation that was somewhat more risky might be the entity that would pay 10%. A very risky corporation might have to pay 15 or 20% to borrow money if the federal government was borrowing at 7%.